A wooden crutch tapped once against stone. Then twice. Then a third time, slow, deliberate, in a hall that had gone completely silent. 300 nobles turned their heads. A goblet froze halfway to pale mouth. At the high table, a king who had not been touched by a human hand in 2 centuries set down his cup and watched a small figure walk the long aisle toward him. She wore a servant's plain dress. She carried a tray with one hand. Her left leg ended below the knee, wrapped in clean linen, balanced against a carved crutch she had whittled herself. She did not look at the floor. She looked at him. Her name was Myra. She was 24 years old. And what she was about to ask him, in front of his entire court, would unmake 200 years of law inside that hall. Why was she walking toward him? Why now? Stay with me on this one. Myra had worked in the lower kitchens of the castle since she was 11. That was 13 years of carrying water up stone stairs. 13 years of scrubbing iron pots until her fingers cracked in winter. 13 years of being invisible. And invisibility, she had learned, was a kind of power if you were willing to use it. People said things in front of her that they would never say in front of someone they noticed. Stewards spoke of bribes. Cooks spoke of poisonings. Nobles spoke of plans. Myra listened. Myra remembered. She kept it all inside her head, the way other people kept coins inside a locked box. She never spent any of it. Not until now. She had lost the leg when she was 7. A horse cart had bolted in the village square. Her mother had pushed her clear of the wheels and taken the worst of it herself. Myra had crawled out from under the cart with one leg crushed and her mother already gone. The castle had taken her in because the old housekeeper at the time had pitied a child with no one. The leg below the knee had been cut clean a week later by a barber who smelled of wine and apologized while he worked. She did not cry. She had decided at 7 years old that crying was something she could not afford. She had not cried since. The crutch she walked on tonight was her 4th. She had carved each one herself from a different piece of fallen oak. She knew the weight of every one of them. She knew exactly how much pressure her armpit could take before the skin broke. She knew which floor stones in the great hall were uneven and which would catch the rubber tip if she did not lift cleanly. Tonight she would have to cross all of them. Tonight she had counted them while she scrubbed the kitchen floor at dawn. 72 stones from the servant's door to the foot of the high table. She had whispered the number to herself like a prayer. The king at that high table was called Kale by the very few who still remembered loving him. The rest called him sire, or majesty, or your grace, or whatever word kept their throats safe. He was tall, lean, dark-haired, pale as old parchment. He looked 30. He had been alive for 911 years. 200 of those years had been spent inside this castle, without once setting foot outside the gate. 200 years of being fed from chained captives brought up from the lower cells. 200 years of pureblood nobles whispering at his shoulder about what was best for him. 200 years of forgetting slowly the smell of rain on grass. His court was made of his own blood. His cousin Lord Vaspar. His cousin Lady Cresswin. His younger brother Lord Haver. And below them, 300 pureblood vampires who had decided long ago that humans were cattle and that the king's old fondness for the human world was a sickness to be managed. They managed it the way a careful farmer manages a wound on a valuable horse. Quietly, cleanly, forever. The feast tonight was the first feast of the long autumn. Every pureblood family in the kingdom was present. The hall was lit by 900 candles. The long banquet table was set with white linen. The wine was old and dark. The conversation, before Myra walked in, had been about the harvest of human villages to the south, and which villages would be permitted to keep their fathers this winter. They spoke of fathers the way men speak of cattle. Haver laughed. Cresswin tilted her glass. The king watched, said nothing, and lifted his goblet to his mouth. That goblet was the reason Myra was walking. 3 nights earlier, on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor outside the wine cellar, She had heard the head steward whisper something to a man she did not know. The whisper had been about the king's cup, about a powder, about a slow weight that built in the blood and could not be tasted in good red wine. The steward had laughed and said the king had not raised his voice in 40 years and would not raise it now. The other man had said good. Then they had walked away, leaving a girl on her knees in the dark, who suddenly understood the shape of every strange thing she had seen for the last decade. Why the king was pale even for a vampire. Why he did not hunt. Why he sat through council meetings looking at the wall. Why his cousins answered every question for him. He was being poisoned. Slowly, carefully, by his own blood. And the only person who knew was a one-legged kitchen girl, who no one had looked at since the day she arrived. Now here's the thing. She could have told someone. She could have whispered it to the cook. She could have written it on a scrap of parchment and slipped it under a door. But she had lived in that castle for 13 years. She knew exactly what happened to servants who knew things. They were found at the bottom of the well. So she did the only thing that would keep her alive long enough to be useful. She walked into the great hall in front of 300 enemies, and she asked the king a question that could not be answered in private. The high table sat on a low stone dais. There were 9 chairs along it. The king's chair was the center one, taller than the rest, carved with the old crest of the first vampire line. The chair to his right had been empty for 200 years. No human had ever sat there. No vampire had been permitted. It was a place left for someone the king no longer believed in. Myra had been told as a child that the chair was kept polished by a single servant, whose only job was to dust it. She had thought even then that it was a sad job. She reached the foot of the dais. Her crutch tapped once more and stopped. She lifted the tray she had been carrying and set it gently on the lowest step. On the tray was a single clay cup of water from the kitchen well. Plain water. No wine. She had carried it the full length of the hall not because anyone had asked her to, but because a servant carrying nothing would have been stopped at the door. A servant carrying a tray was furniture. She knew that. She had counted on it. Lord Haver, the king's younger brother, was the first to speak. He laughed first. He always laughed first. He said something cruel and loud about cripples in the great hall and the smell of the kitchens. 24 nobles laughed with him. Cresswin smiled behind her glass. Vaspar did not laugh. Vaspar watched. Vaspar was the dangerous one. Myra had learned that years ago. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the king. Her voice when it came was quiet. It was the voice of a girl who had spent 13 years being told to be quiet. But it was clear, and every person in that hall heard her. She said only 4 words. She said, "Can I sit here?" And then she pointed, with one small steady hand, at the empty chair to his right. The hall did not gasp. It went silent in a different way. Silent the way a forest goes silent when a wolf is near, and the birds have decided not to make the mistake of being the first sound. The candles flickered. Haver's smile slipped. Cresswin lowered her glass. Vaspar did not move. He was watching the king now, and only the king. Kale, the vampire king, looked at the small figure standing at the foot of his dais. He looked at the wooden crutch. He looked at the folded linen where her left leg ended. He looked at the clay cup of plain water on the tray. He looked finally at her face. She held his eyes. She did not look away. She did not lower her chin. She did not pretend to be small. She had decided in the kitchen at dawn that she would not pretend tonight. If she was going to die in this hall, she would die looking up. The king set his goblet down. The sound of metal on wood was the only sound in the hall. He breathed in once slowly. His eyes, for the first time in years, came alive. Haver shifted in his chair. Cresswin looked at Vaspar. Vaspar's hand moved, very slightly, toward the inside of his coat. Kale saw it. He did not look at his cousin. He looked at Myra. And he said one word. He said yes. The hall did not breathe. The chair to his right, which no human had ever touched, was now hers. 200 years of pureblood law had been broken by a single syllable from the only man in the room with the authority to break it. The nobles understood in the same second that something had changed that could not be changed back. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. There are darker hours in this story than the one we just left. Myra did not climb the dais quickly. She could not. She set her crutch on the first step, lifted her weight, breathed, and climbed. 3 steps. The king watched her the whole way. He did not offer his hand. He understood, somehow, that offering would have been an insult. She reached the chair. She turned. She sat. The crutch she leaned against the carved arm. The folded linen of her left leg rested where any other leg would have rested. She put both her hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked at the goblet of dark wine sitting between her and the king. And then, in a voice still quiet, but now meant for him alone, she said the next thing she had come there to say. She said, "Do not drink from that cup again tonight." She said, "There is a powder in it." She said, "Your brother knows." She said, "Your cousin knows." She said, "I have heard them." The king did not turn his head. He did not look at Haver. He did not look at Vaspar. He looked only at the wine in front of him, and then, slowly, he pushed the goblet 6 inches to the side. The movement was small. The meaning was enormous. Every noble at the high table saw it. Haver's hand closed around the edge of his own cup. Cresswin looked, for the first time that night, frightened. Vaspar stood up. Vaspar said, with the practiced calm of a man who had been ready for this night for 40 years, that the king was unwell, that the servant girl had clearly disturbed him, that she should be removed and questioned in the lower cells. He said it the way a doctor speaks of a fever. He gestured to the 2 guards at the wall. They were his guards. Myra had known that the moment she entered the hall. They were not the king's. The king's old guard had been retired, one by one, over the last 100 years. Replaced, quietly, by Vaspar's men. The king raised one hand. The guards stopped where they stood. They did not look at Vaspar. They looked at the king. That was the second thing that night that should not have happened. Vaspar's face did not move, but his jaw set just slightly, in the way of a man who has just realized that one of his calculations from a long time ago has come undone. He sat back down. He did not look at Haver. Haver was sweating now. Haver was younger. Haver had not been ready for tonight at all. He had been told this would be a feast like any other. The king spoke again. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. He said that the chalice would be brought to the center of the table. He said that it would be tasted by the head steward. He said that the head steward would be brought to the hall now. He said that no one was to leave the hall. He said all of it without looking at anyone but the wine. The hall began, very slowly, to understand what was happening. 300 purebloods who had spent the night laughing at a kitchen girl understood that the kitchen girl had walked in here with a key, and that the king had just turned it. The head steward was a man named Orlin. He was brought in from the side door by 2 of the king's own remaining guard. He was a small man, gray at the temples, who had served in this castle for 60 years. He had served Haver's drinks for the last 20 of them. When he saw the king looking at him, and saw Myra sitting in the empty chair, he understood everything in a single breath. He did not run. There was nowhere to run. The king told him to take the goblet. Orlin took it. The king told him to drink. The hall held its breath. Orlin lifted the cup. His hand shook. He looked just once at Lord Haver. Haver did not meet his eyes. That was the moment Orlin understood that he had been a tool, and that tools are not protected. He drank. He set the cup down. He stood there in the middle of 300 watching nobles, and he waited. So did everyone else. So did Myra. She did not look away. She had decided long ago that if she was going to be part of a thing, she was going to be part of all of it. Orlin began to sweat within a minute. His hands began to tremble within 2. Within 4, he was sitting on the stone floor, his back against the high table, breathing in short, hard pulls. He looked up at the king. He did not ask for mercy. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is admitting to something he has known about himself for a very long time. Then he closed his eyes. The hall watched a man die over the slow turning of a glass. It took 11 minutes. The king watched every one of them. He did not look at Haver until the 11th minute was over. When he finally turned his head, Haver was already on his feet trying to leave. The king's guards, the few that remained loyal, were already between him and the doors. He did not get 3 steps. He stopped. He turned. He looked at the high table. His older brother was watching him with the patience of a man who had been waiting 200 years to be allowed to see what was in front of him. Haver opened his mouth. He started to speak. He started to say something about being misled, about Vaspar, about ancient council orders. The king raised one finger. Haver stopped speaking. He did not start again. Vaspar, however, did. Vaspar stood once more. Vaspar was not Haver. Vaspar had not been improvising. Vaspar had spent 100 years preparing for the possibility that this night might come, and he was ready. He addressed the hall, not the king. He spoke of the old council, of pureblood law, of the necessity of restraint upon a monarch who had loved a human queen long ago and had never fully recovered from her death. He spoke of duty. He spoke of bloodline. He spoke of the danger of letting a king walk among cattle. He used that word. Cattle. The hall did not laugh this time. The hall did not know whether to laugh. 200 years ago they would have. Tonight a one-legged girl was sitting in the empty chair, and the king had said yes, and the steward was dead on the floor, and the wine had been poisoned, and the air in the hall had changed. When Vaspar was finished, the king looked at him for a long moment. Then the king turned to Myra. He did not speak to her. He gestured gently with his open hand, as if to say, the floor is yours if you want it. She had not expected that. She had expected to deliver her warning, sit very still, and either live or die based on what he decided. She had not expected to be asked to speak in front of 300 enemies. But she had walked 72 stones to get here. She was not going to waste the chair. She placed both hands flat on the table again. She did not stand. Standing would have meant the crutch. Sitting was steadier. She said in that same quiet kitchen girl voice that she was not a witness brought by anyone. She said no one had sent her. She said she had heard the plan with her own ears, in the corridor outside the wine cellar, 3 nights ago, on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. She named the steward. She named the powder by the name she had heard them call it. She named the night they had begun using it, which was the night of the king's last public ride, 41 years ago. She named Haver. She named Vaspar. She did not name Cresswin because she had not heard Cresswin. She would not lie even in the chair. The hall noticed that too. Then she said the part that mattered most. She said the powder was not the only thing. She said the chained captives in the lower cells had been chosen, for 100 years, not at random but specifically. She said they were drawn from families of the very few human nobles who had once spoken in favor of the king. She said this on the authority of her own eyes. She had cleaned those cells for 3 years. She had seen the family seals on the rags of the dying. She named 4 of those families. She named them slowly. 3 of those names belonged to lines the Pureblood Council had publicly mourned a century ago. Lines they had claimed died in plague. Lines they had buried in stone tombs that, the hall now understood, had been empty the whole time. The hall was no longer silent because it was afraid. The hall was silent because it was beginning to be angry. Not all of it. Some of it. But enough of it. 200 years of pureblood law had built a thing that depended on every single noble believing the same lie at the same time. One small voice in the empty chair had cracked the lie. Cracks spread. The king knew that. Vaspar knew that. Haver was no longer relevant. The king stood. He had not stood at a feast in 60 years. The entire hall stood with him because they had to. He looked at Myra. He told her quietly that she would not be returning to the kitchens. He told her that the chair she was sitting in was hers, now, by the old right of the protected. He named her that in front of the hall in the old language. Protected. Once that word is spoken by a monarch of his line, it cannot be unspoken by anyone, including the monarch. Vaspar's face finally moved. It was a small movement, but it was the movement of a man who has just lost a hand of cards he thought he could not lose. The king then turned to the hall. He spoke for 10 minutes. He spoke of the old oath his line had taken when the first vampire kings rose, the oath that humans were kin, not cattle. He spoke of the slow drift away from that oath, century by century, council by council, dinner by dinner. He spoke of the men and women in his own family who had decided without him that he should be kept in this castle like a sick animal. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. Every word landed in a room that had already begun to understand the shape of what it had been part of. When he was done, he gave 3 orders. The first was that Haver was to be confined to the South Tower, alone, without his servants, until the council of the old line could be reconvened to judge him. The second was that Vaspar was to be removed from his seat on that council, his guards stripped from the castle, and his properties searched, beginning with the steward's chambers. The third was that the chained captives in the lower cells were to be unchained that night, fed, clothed, and returned to whatever family remained to them, at the king's own cost. He said all 3 in the same quiet voice. None of them were questioned. None of them could be. Then he sat down. The hall slowly sat with him. He turned to the girl in the chair at his right. He did not smile. He had not smiled in a very long time, and he was not going to start tonight, because the night was not over and she would have known a false smile when she saw one. But he looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at the first window that has been opened in a sealed room in 200 years. And he said only one more thing to her that night, quietly in the old language, which she did not speak but understood the weight of. He said, "Thank you for walking that far." Myra did not go back to the kitchens. She did not go back to the lower wing, where she had slept on a straw pallet for 13 years. She was given a small room off the king's library, with a single window that faced east, because she had told a servant once in passing that she had never seen the sunrise from a height. The servant had remembered. Servants remember the kindest things people accidentally say. The king had asked, and the servant had told him, and the room had been given. Haver did not survive his year in the South Tower. He was found one morning in the spring, hanged by his own belt from the iron ring on the wall. Some said it was guilt. Some said it was Vaspar. Myra said nothing. She had stopped speaking unless she had to. Vaspar himself stood trial in front of what remained of the old council, which the king had rebuilt slowly, naming 3 human elders to it for the first time in 500 years. Vaspar argued for 2 days. He was articulate. He was calm. He was, in the end, found guilty of conspiracy against the throne and of the murder, by long arrangement, of 4 pureblood lines. He was sentenced to exile, stripped of his name, and walked out of the castle gate on foot with no coat and no horse. He was never seen again. The forest takes vampires who have nowhere left to go. Cresswen, who had only smiled but had not spoken in the conspiracy, was permitted to remain at court. She was permitted because Myra said so. Myra had told the king in private weeks later that smiling was not the same as planning, and that the court would need at least one face it recognized, or it would break. The king had listened. He had been listening to her by then for some time. The chained captives were freed that same night. Most of them were too weak to walk. They were carried up from the lower cells on stretchers made of the long banquet table itself, which the king ordered taken apart for that purpose. The white linen was torn into bandages. The dark wine, the entire vintage, was poured out onto the courtyard stones. The pureblood nobles watched it run between the cobbles. Some of them wept. Most of them did not know why. The king began to ride again in the second year. Short rides at first, just to the river and back, with Myra on a quiet mare beside him. She had never ridden before. She was not good at it. He did not laugh when she nearly slid off the saddle on the first day, because she had told him, on the night of the feast, that she had not cried since she was 7, and he understood by then that laughter at the wrong moment is the same as a tear in the wrong eye. She learned to ride the way she had learned everything else. Slowly, without complaint, with a stubbornness that did not need to be loud. By the 4th month, she could keep pace with him at a slow canter along the river road. By the 6th month, she rode beside him through the human villages he had not visited in 200 years, and the village children, who had been told stories about the cruel king in the stone hall, looked up from the dust of the road and saw a tall, pale man riding next to a small woman with a wooden crutch tied to her saddle, and they did not run. Some of them waved. Myra waved back. The king did not wave, because he did not yet know how, but he learned that too, eventually, the same way he learned to nod at the bakers and the smiths and the old women selling apples at the gate. She did not stop being who she was. She still woke before dawn. She still walked the corridors of the castle with her wooden crutch, which she refused to trade for the carved silver one the king's craftsman offered her. She said the oak knew her weight. She kept the room with the east window. She kept her own counsel. She kept, above all, her habit of listening. People said in the years after that the vampire king had taken a human consort. That was not exactly true. He had taken an advisor. He had taken the only person in the castle who had ever looked him in the eye when she had nothing to gain by doing it. What grew between them grew slowly, the way oak grows. He never asked her to be anything she was not. She never asked him to be human. They sat together at the high table every feast for the rest of her life, and the chair on his right, once empty for 200 years, was never empty again. On the night she died, very old, in the room with the east window, he sat beside the bed and held her hand, which was small and dry and still steady. She told him in the last clear hour that she was not afraid. She told him she had stopped being afraid the moment she had decided, in the kitchen at dawn, to walk the 72 stones. He nodded. He did not weep. Vampires of his line do not weep. But he sat beside her until the morning came through the east window and lit her face, and then he closed her eyes himself, very gently, with 2 fingers, the way a man closes a book he has read more carefully than any other book in his life. The wooden crutch she had carved at 16 still leans, to this day, against the carved arm of the empty chair to the right of the king's chair in the great hall of that castle. No one moves it. No one is allowed to. It taps against the stone sometimes when the wind comes through the high windows, just once, the way it tapped that first night. And every pureblood noble who hears it stops for a moment and remembers that the law of that hall was changed forever, 201 years ago, by a small voice asking a small question. Can I sit here? And the one-word answer that opened a door no one in that castle has been able to close since.